All right. So, let's see. What's the first question on there, you guys?
Why do some of your students have difficulty comprehending what they read, and what steps could you take to help them?
So, maybe we were going to start talking about like what was in chapter 6 related to that, and then maybe we could kind of talk about how that relates to some of the strategies that we currently use in our classes.
Yeah. So chapter 6 was the chapter that really talked about like text structure and the importance of teaching kids like story elements, different types of text structures, whether it's like informative or narrative, if it's expository, and what and if it is informative, is it comparing and contrasting? Is it cause and effect? And so by familiarizing students with those structures, it can improve their comprehension because they're anticipating what to expect within the structure. And I know that I do a lot of that with my students. I do different types of texts with them. So I'll do a narrative, and then we have, a lot of times I'll do summarizing with a narrative text. And so we look for the elements that are important and then have them retell the story using the elements that are important. And then I also do like explicit questions and inferential questions because I want them to know, like, you can look in the text for some questions, but then there's a lot of questions where you really can't. So you have to use your own knowledge and your own experience to come up with the answer for that. So that can be like a hard concept sometimes for students because I'm like, you can't find it in the passage, like it's something we have to kind of think about and talk through. So those were some examples that I kind of thought of.
Yeah, we do a couple of things at the middle school level, and hearing you talk about this is making me think about how nice it would be for all of us in the district teaching at a secondary level to get together on maybe some common structures that we use as students kind of take notes with what they read. And so, two that we do, like one thing we do is we have students make a book out of a blank piece of paper, so that when they're reading not paired passages, because that's a thing that we do throughout 6 through 12. But also, so we have like thinking jobs. Whether if it's a narrative structure, then the thinking job is simply who are the characters, what do they want, what's keeping them from it, right? Or the problem, what's the solution, and then what did the character learn, and therefore what is the lesson and the theme. And then if it's informational text, it's just, and of course we do title for both, because the title, like write down the title first, like if they're going through a test, it's important to know what just to kind of scaffold that in their minds. But so both of them have the titles, but then if it's informational, it's simply title, topic, teaching, and then in the teachings we have like, I call them either stars and stripes or, there's another thing I use. But anyway, like the stars being like the main ideas, and then the stripes being like the details underneath that make up those. So yeah, and then we're trying to at Hillsman make that a same structure 6 through 8, and I'm curious about what kind of structures Brent uses, and like how we could maybe get our structures together so that then and if we could get some specialists in to say, hey, here's gaps you could fill in, or if you wanted to make this a fuller picture, whether it's a narrative text or an informational text, like what we should be doing. What do you think, Brent?
Yeah, I mean, 9th through 12th, we, or, it used to be, I could say we, but we're kind of disconnected now. I would say that I try to focus on like close reading and kind of metacognitive strategies. I feel like, I do a lot of the I guess what you were talking about with Stars and Stripes, I do that more with writing, having them brainstorm, but also like reverse outlines when especially when I'm teaching persuasive writing. Give them like a pretty good example of a argumentative essay, and I have them use the outline form they're going to use to come up with their own, to basically take notes and figure out like what's important in the model first. And but with more complex texts, I I definitely feel like students' big problem is they get lost in like the sea of words, and they don't have the metacognitive strategies that many of us do. Like, I've seen it called in some of the texts we've read for our classes, fix up strategies, like when you don't understand, but often they don't know they don't understand because they haven't paused. So I start off pretty much every class with even 12th grade on level with short texts, like short stories and things like that. And I make a Google document so that I can embed like interactive questions where they read a chunk, and then they have to answer specific questions before they go on. And that really does help them slow down. Reading guides for the lower kind of kids with the lower level reading skills really helps like identify exactly what they need to know to do the more complex thinking that we want them to do after we read. And it's I've been trying to do more metacognitive strategies this semester as part of another class project, and teaching the signpost and notice and note, and trying to get them to not only be able to identify things that I give them on a reading guide, but to really learn the skill of like thinking while reading and doing that work without prompts. Because I think that one thing our students get so dependent on is tell me what to do exactly, how to do it exactly, and then come over and point to where I need to be finding the stuff to do the things. And just like a lot of, I don't know if it's, I guess learned helplessness, but also dependency on structures to kind of do things quickly. And so, trying to get them, yes, when we're doing a tough text, I still provide those things, but also trying to scaffold their ability to do it on their own.
Well, and that was that sentence stems article was talking exactly about that, about how, is it Vygotsky is like the social constructivist theory with scaffolding. The idea of scaffolding isn't just giving support, it's that you give them a little bit more than what they could get by themselves. And so you help them based on their prior knowledge and their prior skills. You give them a little bit more with that structure so they can get a little bit further. But the goal is to take that all away. And so I was thinking, I'm like, we don't do that, do we? Because I just think like with special ed, you're always like accommodations, graphic organizers, you're always giving these aids. And I'm like, if our goal should be to take that away, I'm like, I don't feel like we're doing that. I mean, maybe some people are, but I feel like they're like seniors. They still have the same accommodations. They still get the sentence starters or the sentence stems. They still get the, and so I'm like, I feel like we, and I mean, like a the collective system, like we need to be looking at that. And like in speech pathology, I do that in that, my the cueing that I give students, I take it back. That's one of the things that I work on is like less cues, let them figure it out. But I sit in so many IEP meetings where like they're getting all the things, and I'm like, we're not, bless you, we're not thinking about that last piece of it. You are. I mean, you just said you're trying to get them to be a little bit more independent.
But I don't really necessarily do it in my classes, like, except for maybe the 12th grade. Like 10th grade, I'm trying to get them to do it, but as far as having them, it's like an additional thing. Like, hey, did you notice these are metacognitions, when you read you should, and pointing it out. But I'm still giving them reading guides, because if it's not super approachable, I mean, I can barely get kids to even fill out a reading guide with a page number,
right?
And for every question, much less get them to do like more open-ended and I guess like individual oriented thinking. I tried to do it last year in the fall. They were a handful behavior wise, but their skills were actually better than a lot of 10th grade classes I'd had before. And so I used these, like, I do this after the first unit in 12th grade. I move towards the double column notes where they pull quotes and then they talk about, and I usually have for each, whether it's fiction or whether it's nonfiction, we do Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. So, I changed the questions for what they should be responding with and how they should be responding. But the only kids that liked that in my 10th grade, it was a on-level class, but I ended up recommending those kids for advanced, but not because of that. It just was a coincidence that those kids found that easier because they didn't have to hunt and peck for certain pieces of information. They were able to respond as they read to things that stood out to them. And every other kid hated them. They wanted, because they hunt and peck and they're information seekers, and and I couldn't get them to do the more open-ended. They just felt like kind of lost. And so we took turns, and I ended up just telling other kids, like, look, this is easy. Here is, like, if you want to do it this way, just copy this old one and just put the different chapter number up there. But I need to do this for the other class. So I kind of made arrangements with those kids, and in 12th grade, they will continue to ask for questions because it's easier. But once they get used to it and we do it over and over again, eventually it does lead to better discussions and more comprehension. When we discuss in the class, different things get brought up rather than talking about the same things that everybody found. We have different things, and why did you think that was important? And it just leads to richer discussions. But I haven't had that much success and haven't really pulled the scaffolds back except for in my 12th grade class. But even then, they want the scaffolding. They are very heavily dependent on
it. What you're talking about, though, in terms of some students being ready and willing to move beyond the scaffolding, kind of speaks to the Pearson article about the science of reading instruction, and in terms of how interest plays a role, and in the amount of effort students are willing to expend. But I'm thinking about, like, in like a Socratic seminar style, approach to discussion, it's like some of those kids who are much more like socially and verbally motivated, it's like they will start to do things that you can say, hey, that thinking you just did right there, I need to see more of that in your writing. It's also making me think about ways that we do begin to move beyond the scaffolding in middle school, which is we have a very, very clear structure for claim, evidence, reasoning, for example. But for kids who are using like the going from claim to reasoning, we say, for example, and then from evidence to reasoning to say this shows, but then I will often say to kids, you are ready to graduate from this structure. And these are 10 different other ways you can say, for example, that are much more natural, ways that you're providing background context about the character or the situation that you're talking about, and then there are many, many more ways to, be much more precise in your wording instead of just saying this shows. So.
Yeah, we do the same type of thing in high school. Like, they keep talking about getting aligned with y'all, but we just keep using different things that our coach insists on, but it's the same stuff.
Yeah.
Like last year she forced us to use races, which is fine. It's like restate the question. It's for like mostly constructed response, teaching them how to easily respond in a formulaic way to EOC style writing. But restate the evidence, restate the question, answer the question, cite evidence, and then
summarize.
Explain. And then S is like sum it up. And this year, our coach just loves to try new things. So we're doing C-seat because
that's right. Okay.
I guess the reading score or the writing scores weren't what they wanted, so we're doing a brand new model that basically does the same thing. But C-seat is claims, setup, evidence, analysis, and then tie up. So it's
very similar.
But we're trying to, I guess, increase the complexity of the scaffolds, but we're still expected to provide that scaffolding because the students aren't producing. And it's, when I teach, I don't like, even these questions, I keep thinking about writing as we're talking about reading instruction, because I teach them together. Like, it's so intertwined. Those two skills are, it's hard for me to tease them apart once you get to secondary.
The research supports that. We can talk about it in a minute. No, keep going.
That's basically it. Just that even structurally, the system is imposing more scaffolding and expecting it when we aren't really teaching our kids how to move beyond it. Like, I do think we are teaching them to use the structures, and yes, there are many other words. This is just an example of how to do this, but honestly, whenever we give them we try to give them when we do like the constructed response practices to see how they've improved, we give them the little model. And some of the kids, we tell them, this is not where you write, this is where you look. They'll still just go and fill in each box with like a sentence. And some of them will write down below where we ask them to in another box. It's like if there's not a box of some kind, they don't want to write. And so they'll, even kids that I know could produce different ideas, they still look up and use one of the three like stems, for a transition word. And so I don't know at this point if it's helpful to just keep providing those things and have them continue to emphasize these are the structures to use and using those structures versus moving beyond the structures and creating their work more authentically.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
It's an interesting thing to think about, right? Like it's like they do need. I mean, they become so comfortable with it that it's like that stretching out of their comfort zone is what is the hard part. But that's how you learn too, right? I mean,
One of the reasons why we stuck with CER is because they use that in science. And I was just thinking about in the two resources that I focused on the most, which was the Science of Reading one by Pearson, and then the Writing Rope. Both mention, you know, the importance of reading and writing and teaching both across the content. And I've also been reading Natalie Wexler's The Knowledge Gap, you know, so if you think about the vocabulary deficit that kids are showing up to school with, there's also the knowledge deficit, you know. And so I really think that we need to emphasize to content teachers how important it is to utilize these same kinds of structures that we're using in ELA, and also because these structures help them retain more content. In Natalie Wexler's book, she talks about a study where they took groups of students reading, for example, a story about baseball. Well, if you have no background about baseball, like, the story is incomprehensible. But interestingly, students who had background knowledge about baseball but whose reading levels were lower performed at the same level as kids with higher reading levels. And I just lost my train of thought, but I'm sure.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I had this argument with over like comments, you know, going back and forth with the people that created the interims for, you know, I ended up getting kicked off the team by the administrators because I complained so much. But they, this guy was intent on our lowest level readers having one of the passages was from chapter 24 of the Scarlet Letter. And I mean, Nathaniel Hawthorne is incomprehensible to some people who are well educated in reading. I mean, he has sentences that are long. He has, like, you know, pages and pages without a paragraph break. And so we were like, you can't give a kid that has reading difficulties you know, the last chapter of the Scarlet Letter. Like, there's so much context they need. And the guy told me through, like, the text chat that context wasn't important when doing cold reading. That every question had enough context clues that all the questions were answerable, and that my argument about context and how we teach context as teachers was irrelevant. And I was just like,
no, it's not.
It's not. If a kid doesn't know any of the terms that are mentioned, that, you know, like, even talking about, like, you know, when you know, we try to give them examples of, because they do provide a lot of free domain old stuff, and so we'll do like, I forget the name of the poem, but it's by one of those Puritan poets, and it's like about a spinning wheel, and it's, you know, it's about writing poetry, but it's also about making a garment, and just and it's also about, you know, doing it for the glory of God, and they go, and the poet goes detail. It's a detailed, like, analogy and comparison between these processes, but using all the parts of a spinning wheel.
Right.
And it's like, if they don't know what a spinning wheel is, they don't know all these parts. I mean, how, you know, context absolutely matters.
Laura, when you said something, and it just made me go, oh my gosh. So a lot of times, you know, I'll work with kids. I'll be like, "What are you working on in science? What do you know?" And I'll just try to use it to support whatever language skills we're working on. And the PowerPoints that teachers use are so hard to follow.
Oh.
And so sometimes I'm like, I wish they had like a systematic structure, or like,
oh, good point,
where they have like the title, the subheading, they do vocabulary a certain way, you know, like it's so jumbled and really hard to follow. And a lot of times, like, I don't have the content knowledge, right, but I'm looking for like, let's summarize it, let's like, what are the key parts, but it's so messed up, like some of these. And then, like, you know, they'll do one unit and, you know, some people probably found these PowerPoints or were given them, and then the next one is like totally structured differently. It's,
right.
You know, and so
maybe
I was
based
like,
on like creativity or design,
right,
trying to be like fun or something.
But I was like, you know, if we could do that in a more systematic way that helps kids see the structure.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm like, you can't, like, I can't. It's so, like, some are so overwhelming with like colors and fonts and stuff, and you know, I'm like, I'm like, what are you learning about? And they're like, I don't know, you know, like they have no idea. And I'm like, okay, let's go back a few slides, you know. I'm like, what, you know. And so I'm like, I feel like they should be able to know what they're learning about, if it's a subheading, something, you know. But I was thinking about when you said that in like different contexts, like some are so hard to understand, and like I don't have the context, you know, like it's just like it's so it's disjointed, it's confusing, it's not in a way that my mind thinks, you know. And so I'm like, I can only imagine that students are like, what?
Oh, that's such a great point. I mean, in the same way that we have these scaffolds in place that we're building for writing, what about like capturing main ideas in different content areas, and then like you're talking about, maybe if it's a slide format, and then the way they apply that scaffold, whether it's about baseball or organic chemistry or the Civil War or whatever it is, that if they're like seeing that over and over, that maybe, you know, they can become more adept at capturing information about subjects about which they know nothing.
Yeah, and I was, you know, we've talked a little bit about how reading and writing are totally intertwined, but, you know, as I was looking through chapter 7, just thinking about how many of the things that, it's just like we do so many of these things, and I feel like constantly like, oh my God, what do I do with these kids? And then when I look back, I do a lot, and we do a lot. But it's like, it's not sufficient for, you know, I don't know if I know engagement has a lot to do with it. Kids bringing their energy to it is a problem. But I was even looking at how a lot of these things I use with my AP class, like we joke about Space Cat. I love Space Cat, but it's a pretty complex way to, you know, or a simple way to get some complex ways for, or knowledge of, you know, things you have to really understand to be able to analyze an argument. And so my best readers are responsive to these, and they can use the structures and move beyond them, but sometimes I feel like it's hard to even get my students to use the simple structures to, you know, the scaffoldings in place. And so I guess that was kind of leading me to, you know, once I was like, man, I do so much of this, but one thing I don't have a lot of knowledge on is the, you know, this last question about intervention programs for like readers and literacy in general. Like, is that talking about school-wide systems for identifying kids and
Well, I was thinking about like they just started with the new reading phonics, science of reading curriculum. They also started this wit and wisdom curriculum, and they do a ton of reading and writing. So they do so much reading on a passage, and then they write about it. And so again, I'm like, are we going to see these kids coming up now that have some of those skills that they're going to be better at writing about a passage and finding that evidence and explaining their thought process, and I was wondering if that is like because that's a reading and writing program that is teaching some of those skills that we're and they do like cause and effect, persuasive, they do those different structures too. And so I'm like, that seems like an evidence-based program, like they're hitting all the right things, and again, mine is in fourth, so they've had it for 2-3 years now.
Okay.
But their writing has improved quite a bit, so I can see those things incorporated in their writing. So I'm like, that gives me a little bit of like, maybe that's to come.
So I guess for this intervention program, like I was thinking about, okay, what could I incorporate in my classroom? I mean, all of these things that we've talked about, all of the strategies for, for writing, like, structures to help, like we talked about the races, the CER, all of these things that, provide a scaffolding for kids to do things more easily. Is that, I mean, those are components of an intervention program, right? Like, as far as strategies to support kids, or are we really talking about something beyond the
I think we do
structures
have
and
intervention
scaffolds?
programs in place now at the elementary school levels with the universal screening.
Okay.
But I think, like we've talked about
If they
before,
work,
we have at
Not
the
at our
secondary
level.
level all
Okay.
these kids who missed out.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm working on is talking about the importance of, and this kind of comes back around to something we've talked about before, with the idea of teaching students how to be better parents in the long run. But I'm looking a lot at like the problem of short-termism in our schools and just like trying to move the needle on these scores. And what I want to do is, it also related to a metacognitive sense, is teaching kids about the history of literacy in our country and the importance of literacy, the relationship between low literacy rates and high incarceration rates. But just hoping, I mean, the truth is, these kids we teach are going to have kids before too long. I mean, and I'm probably still going to be in long enough to teach some of these kids. And like we say, the appling doesn't fall far from the tree. Like, if we could just think in longer terms about, I mean, so many of our kids just do not value the acts of reading and writing. And I think that's a major point that's missing in all of this, like, really detailed stuff about what we're doing. I mean, but what about the fact that, like, I don't know if we're teaching kids about why literacy matters.
Yeah. I mean, that is the big thing that, I think the system falls short on. It's like, get them to do it, get them to do it, get them to do it for this purpose and this reason. But by the time they get to the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, especially if they're like at risk and they're thinking of dropping out, like, I can barely get them to do anything.
Yeah,
And
and that's when we need to be like, think about your babies that are coming.
Yeah. and yeah, it's like, I guess I need to spend more time, but already
No, I mean,
feel
that's
like
where you had that
it's-
great idea for the class.
Well, yeah, but kids would have to take that class, and
Yeah.
it's just like, how do we embed that from
In-
the beginning all the way through? Is
Into
like
chapter 24 of The Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
We're still testing you on this.
Oh goodness.
Well, is that a good thought to end on?
I don't know. Do y'all have
Were there any notes or anything you guys had that you wanted to like just kind of squeeze in there as far as like your readings, your diving into these articles? Did we cover everything?
I feel like
Yeah.
we covered a lot.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks y'all.